The morning sun peeked through the windows of Golden Cup Diner as Mira balanced 3 plates of steaming pancakes, her fingers dancing to a melody only she could hear. The smell of fresh coffee and maple syrup filled the air, while the usual buzz of morning conversations created its own kind of music. "Order up," called out Uncle Pete from the kitchen window, his voice rough but warm like always. Mira grabbed 2 more plates, somehow managing to slide them onto her already full tray. She'd gotten really good at this balancing act over the past 5 years. Between taking orders and refilling coffee cups, she couldn't help but tap out rhythms on her serving tray. The regular customers had gotten used to her little habits. How she hummed while writing down orders, how her feet moved in tiny dance steps as she walked between tables. Some even joked that she brought music to their breakfast. "Hey, Treamer," called Mrs. Kumar from table 6, waving her empty coffee cup with a smile. "Got another song in your head today?" The elderly woman had been coming to the diner every morning for years, always ordering the same thing: wheat toast and scrambled eggs with extra pepper. "Always?" Mira laughed, hurrying over with the coffee pot. As she poured, her free hand unconsciously tapped out the beat of the new song she'd worked on until 2 a.m. last night. The melody had come to her while she was closing up the diner, inspired by the rhythm of spoons stirring coffee and plates clinking against tables. Back in the kitchen, she pulled out the small notepad she kept in her apron pocket. Between orders, she scribbled down lyrics on the edges of order slips. Words about dreams in coffee cups, about sunrise hopes and midnight wishes. Uncle Pete pretended to grumble about her wasting paper, but she'd caught him smiling at her notes more than once. The morning rush kept her moving, but her mind wandered to her old upright piano waiting at home. She'd found it at a yard sale 3 years ago, saved up tips for 2 months to buy it. The previous owner had wanted to throw it away, saying it was too out of tune to save. But Mira saw something special in those worn keys. They just needed someone to believe in them again. "Table 12 needs their check," called out Raj, the teenage busboy who had started last week. He was already picking up on the diner's rhythm, learning its daily dance of plates and people. As Mira reached for her order pad, a napkin slipped from her pocket, covered in music notes she'd drawn during her break. Mr. Thompson from table 8 picked it up, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he handed it back. "You know," he said, stirring his coffee thoughtfully, "my wife used to say that people who make music while they work put a little magic into everything they do." Mira tucked the napkin back into her pocket, feeling the weight of all her scribbled songs. Little pieces of dreams collected between coffee refills and breakfast specials. The diner wasn't just her workplace. It was where she gathered stories, found rhythms in the ordinary, and learned that sometimes the best music comes from the most unexpected places. The morning sun climbed higher, streaming through the windows and making the old coffee machines gleam. Another day was rolling forward, full of orders to take and tables to serve. But in Mira's head, every coffee cup clink was a piano key, every conversation a potential chorus, and every moment another note in the song she was meant to play. She straightened her apron, grabbed her serving tray, and stepped back into the morning rush. There were customers to serve and songs to write, and somehow, in her world, they were becoming the same thing. Every Tuesday morning, like clockwork, the old man with kind eyes would sit at table 3, ordering nothing but black coffee and plain toast. Mira had noticed him watching her over the past few weeks, especially when she tapped rhythms on her serving tray or hum while arranging silverware. But it wasn't the uncomfortable kind of watching. There was something gentle about his attention, like he was listening for something beyond the diner's usual clatter. "You've got music in your hands," he said one morning, catching her off guard as she set down his coffee. His voice was warm and scratchy, like an old vinyl record. "I recognize that rhythm you were tapping. Thelonious Monk, wasn't it?" Mira nearly dropped the coffee pot. Nobody had ever recognized her random tapping before, let alone identified the jazz piece she'd been practicing in her head. "You know Monk?" she asked, forgetting for a moment about the other tables waiting for their orders. The old man smiled, introducing himself as Mr. Lee. Know him. I played with him once, years ago, back when the Blue Note Jazz Club was the heart of the city's music scene. He pulled out his wallet, showing her a faded photograph of a younger version of himself sitting at a grand piano, surrounded by legendary jazz musicians. During her break, Mira found herself sitting across from Mr. Lee, listening to stories about smoky jazz clubs and late-night jam sessions. His eyes lit up when he talked about music, his weathered hands moving through the air like they were still playing those old tunes. "You know," he said, pushing his empty cup aside, "I've been watching how you move around this place. Every step, every gesture, it's all music to you, isn't it? Even the way you arrange plates has rhythm." Mira felt her cheeks warm. She'd always tried to hide her musical habits at work, worried they made her look unprofessional. "I can't help it," she admitted. "Everything sounds like music to me. The coffee machine's got this perfect swing beat, and the kitchen bell rings in G sharp." Mr. Lee laughed, but not unkindly. "That's exactly how it should be. Music isn't just about sitting at an instrument. It's about hearing the melody in everyday life." He paused, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. "Tell me, where do you play?" The question made her stomach twist. "Oh, just at home. On my old upright. It needs tuning, but just at home." Mr. Lee's eyebrows shot up. "With hands like yours, that's like keeping a bird in a cage." He leaned forward, his expression serious. "You know, I still have my studio. Nothing fancy, but there's a decent piano there. Better than a worn-out upright." Uncle Pete called from the kitchen, saving Mira from having to respond. But throughout her shift, she kept thinking about Mr. Lee's words. She caught him watching again as she delivered plates to the window booth, her feet unconsciously moving to the rhythm of Ray Charles playing on the diner's old radio. Before leaving, Mr. Lee wrote something on his napkin, an address and phone number. "Tuesdays and Thursdays, I give lessons to serious students," he said, sliding the napkin across the table. "But mostly, I just like to play with other musicians who hear the music in everything." Mira stared at the napkin, her heart beating in syncopated rhythm. "I'm just a waitress," she said softly. Mr. Lee stood up, straightening his worn jacket. Duke Ellington worked as a soda jerk. Ella Fitzgerald was homeless before she found her stage. Every musician starts somewhere. He tipped an imaginary hat. The question is, where are you going to let your music take you? As she watched him leave, Mira felt the napkin burning in her pocket, right next to her notebook full of unplayed songs. The diner's usual sounds swirled around her, clinking plates, murmured conversations, sizzling griddles, but now they seemed to be asking the same question. Where was she going to let her music take her? The citywide music festival poster had been hanging in the diner's window for weeks, its bright colors fading a little more each day in the sun. Mira had been carefully avoiding looking at it, just like she'd been avoiding Mr. Lee's knowing glance every time he caught her staring at it when she thought nobody was watching. "You're going to wear a hole in that floor," Uncle Pete said one morning, watching her pace back and forth behind the counter. She'd been holding the same coffee pot for 10 minutes, lost in thought about the music festival application form sitting in her apron pocket. "I don't know what you're talking about," Mira mumbled, finally remembering to pour coffee for the customer at the counter. Her hands were shaking slightly, making the dark liquid ripple in the cup. 3 sugars, extra cream, called out Mrs. Kumar from her usual spot. "And maybe a side of courage for our musician here." She winked at Mira. Word had gotten around about Mr. Lee's offer to help her prepare for the festival, and now it seemed like every regular customer had an opinion to share. The bell of the door chimed, and Mr. Lee walked in, carrying a newspaper under his arm. But instead of heading to his usual table, he sat right at the counter, directly in front of where Mira was trying to hide behind the coffee machine. "I saw something interesting in today's paper," he said casually, unfolding it to reveal an article about past festival winners. Did you know that last year's winner was a mechanic? Played the violin in between fixing cars. He looked up at Mira. Sometimes the best musicians are the ones who bring their everyday life into their music. Before Mira could respond, her supervisor, Miss Patel, emerged from the office with her usual stern expression. Mira, the salt shakers won't refill themselves. And please stop that humming. This is a diner, not a concert hall. Mira's face burned as she grabbed the salt container and started working her way around the tables. She could feel Mr. Lee watching her, could sense the encouragement from her regular customers, but Miss Patel's words echoed in her head. Maybe she was fooling herself. Maybe she should just stick to being a waitress. During her break, she sat at the empty counter, absently drawing music notes on her order pad. Mr. Lee had stayed behind, nursing his third cup of coffee. "You know what the hardest note to play is?" he asked suddenly. Mira looked up, curious despite herself. "Which one?" "The first one." He smiled gently. "Everything after that is just following your heart. But that first note, that takes more courage than talent." "But what if I'm not good enough?" The words tumbled out before she could stop them. "What if I make a fool of myself? What if?" "What if you're amazing?" Mr. Lee countered. "What if you get up there and play exactly what's in your heart, and it touches someone else's heart too? What if you inspire another scared musician to take their first step?" Just then, Miss Patel's voice cut through their conversation. "Break time's over. And Mira, if I catch you daydreaming during the lunch rush again, we'll have to discuss your hours." Mira stood up, straightening her apron with trembling hands. But before she could walk away, Mr. Lee spoke again, his voice quiet but firm. "You know, I once knew a young musician who was so scared of performing that she threw up before every show." He paused, making sure Mira was listening. "Her name was Nina Simone. Sometimes the biggest talent comes with the biggest fears." That evening, after her shift ended, Mira stood in front of the festival poster. Her reflection in the window glass showed a tired waitress in a slightly stained apron. But when she closed her eyes, she could hear the music that had been building inside her all these years, the coffee shop symphonies, the late-night melodies, the dreams she'd kept tucked away like spare change in her apron pocket. With hands that still smelled of coffee and syrup, she pulled out the crumpled application form. Maybe it was time to find out what would happen if she stopped running from her music and started running toward it instead. The sun hadn't even risen when Mira pushed open the door to Mr. Lee's studio, clutching a paper cup of coffee she'd made at home. The street was quiet except for the distant rumble of early morning delivery trucks. Her fingers were still sore from yesterday's practice, but she couldn't stop smiling. She'd finally gotten through her whole song without stumbling over the bridge section. Mr. Lee's studio wasn't what most people would imagine when they heard the word studio. It was just a converted garage with old concert posters covering the walls. But to Mira, it felt like stepping into another world. The grand piano in the corner might have been secondhand, but its voice was rich and warm, like honey in sunlight. "Early bird gets the best notes," Mr. Lee said, appearing from behind a stack of music books. He'd started keeping the studio open early just for her, knowing she had to practice before her diner shifts. "Let's hear what you've got today." As Mira played, she could feel the difference from even a week ago. Her hands were stronger now, more confident. The melody she'd been hearing in her head for months was finally finding its way into the real world. Mr. Lee sat in his old armchair, eyes closed, foot tapping along. "Good," he said when she finished. "But you're still holding back. Remember what I told you. Play it like you're telling a story. Your story." So Mira played again, this time letting herself remember all the moments that had led to this one. The way Uncle Pete would sing old love songs while cooking. The rhythm of Mrs. Kumar stirring sugar into her coffee every morning. The sound of rain on the diner's windows during quiet midnight shifts. "Now that's music," Mr. Lee smiled. You're not just playing notes anymore. You're sharing something real. Back at the diner, everything was different now. Even Miss Patel had noticed the change, though she tried not to show it. Mira moved through her shifts with a new kind of grace, like she was dancing to music only she could hear. Her regular customers became her unofficial cheerleaders. "Play that new part for us," Mrs. Kumar would say during slow afternoons, and Mira would tap out the rhythm on the counter, using salt shakers as improvised percussion. The teenage buzzboy started humming her melodies while clearing tables. Uncle Pete would stick his head out of the kitchen to listen when she practiced her lyrics under her breath. Even the grumpy morning regulars seemed to soften when they heard her quietly singing while refilling their coffee cups. One evening, after a particularly long shift, Mira looked down at her hands. They were a mess of paper cuts from order tickets, small burns from hot plates, and calluses from piano keys. But when she sat at the piano now, those same hands could create something beautiful. "Your music's different these days," Mr. Lee commented during one of their sessions. "More honest." Mira nodded, understanding what he meant. She'd stopped trying to write what she thought festival judges would want to hear. Instead, she was writing what she knew. Songs about night shift dreams and fluorescent light hopes, about people finding friendship over countless cups of coffee. "Listen to this part," she said excitedly, playing a new section she'd written. "It's about that couple that comes in every Sunday. You know, the ones who've been married for 60 years. He still orders her pancakes exactly the way she likes them, even though she pretends to complain about him fussing." The melody was simple but touching, like a love song written in maple syrup and coffee stains. Mr. Lee listened, nodding slowly, a proud smile spreading across his face. "Now that's what I call a story worth telling," he said when she finished. "Keep playing like that, and you won't be performing for the festival judges. They'll be experiencing a piece of real life, served up with heart and harmony." As the festival drew closer, Mira's hands grew stronger, her voice more confident. Every coffee spill and customer complaint became another note in her symphony. She was learning that being a waitress hadn't kept her from being a musician. It had given her a whole world of music she never would have found anywhere else. The morning everything changed started like any other. Mira was arranging sugar packets by color. A nervous habit she developed as the festival drew closer. When she noticed Mr. Lee hadn't arrived for his usual Tuesday breakfast, the empty spot at table 3 seemed to echo with silence. "Maybe he's just running late," Uncle Pete suggested, sliding a plate of pancakes through the kitchen window. But by noon, the untouched coffee cup Mira had automatically set out grew cold, and an uneasy feeling settled in her stomach. The phone call came during the afternoon lull. Mrs. Kumar answered it. She'd been chatting with Mira about festival preparations when the diner's old landline rang. Mira watched as the elderly woman's face grew serious, her hand gripping the receiver tightly. "It's about Mr. Lee," Mrs. Kumar said softly, covering the mouthpiece. "He's in the hospital. Had a stroke early this morning." The words hit Mira like a physical blow. The order pad slipped from her hands, scattering paper across the floor. She could barely hear Mrs. Kumar talking about visiting hours over the sudden rushing in her ears. "Go," Uncle Pete said, appearing beside her. "We'll cover your shift." He was already untying her apron strings, his usual gruff manner softened with concern. The hospital corridor seemed endless, its fluorescent lights harsh after the warm glow of the diner. Mira found Mr. Lee's room at the end of the hall. He looked small in the hospital bed, surrounded by beeping machines, but his eyes lit up when he saw her. He couldn't speak much. The stroke had affected his left side, but he managed to squeeze her hand when she sat beside him. Mira pulled out her phone, hands shaking as she navigated to the recording she'd made of her latest practice session. "Listen," she whispered, placing the phone on his pillow. "I finally got that tricky part right." The gentle piano notes filled the sterile room, transforming it somehow. Mr. Lee closed his eyes, his good hand moving slightly, still conducting even now. Back at the diner, word spread quickly. Regular customers started bringing get-well cards for Mira to deliver. The teenage busboy threw a cartoon of Mr. Lee playing piano on the specials board, complete with jazz notes floating around his head. "I can't do this without him," Mira confessed to Mrs. Kumar one quiet afternoon. She was supposed to be refilling salt shakers, but instead, she sat slumped at the counter, the festival program crumpled in her hand. "The festival's in 2 weeks. I'm not ready." "Nonsense," Mrs. Kumar replied, her voice firm but kind. "Everything he taught you is still right here." She tapped Mira's chest, right over her heart. "The music didn't leave just because he's not sitting at table 3. The diner staff rallied around her. Uncle Pete rearranged the schedule so she could visit Mr. Lee during regular hours. The morning shift waitress offered to cover extra days so Mira could practice. Even Ms. Patel, who'd been so strict about Mira's musical tendencies, turned a blind eye when she caught Mira playing piano fingerings on the edge of the counter during slow moments. One evening, after visiting hours, Mira sat at Mr. Lee's piano in the studio. She'd been given a key months ago, but this was the first time she'd come here alone. The silence felt heavy, like a held breath. Her fingers found the keys, beginning the song she'd been working on with Mr. Lee. It was different now, sadder maybe, but also deeper, more real. She played until her arms ached, until the streetlights outside cast long shadows across the floor. When she finally stopped, she heard clapping. The cleaning lady had paused in the doorway, mop in hand, listening. "That was beautiful," she said simply. "Made me think of my own grandpa." Something clicked in Mira's mind then. The music wasn't just hers anymore. It wasn't even just hers and Mr. Lee's. It belonged to everyone who'd ever lost someone, everyone who'd ever been scared, but kept going anyway. She pulled out her phone and recorded herself playing the whole piece, mistakes and all. Tomorrow, she'd take it to Mr. Lee. Maybe he couldn't be at his piano right now, but that didn't mean the music had to stop. The next morning, she tied on her apron with new determination. The festival might be approaching fast, but she wasn't facing it alone. Every coffee cup she filled, every order she took, reminded her that some of the best music comes from the hardest times. The night before the festival felt different somehow. The usual dinner rush had ended, and Mira was wiping down table 3, Mr. Lee's table, which she noticed how the setting sun made the diner's worn surfaces glow like honey. Even the coffee stains on her apron seemed to shine a little. "Penny for your thoughts," called Uncle Pete from the kitchen. He was making his famous apple pie, the smell of cinnamon and butter filling the air. Ever since Mr. Lee's stroke, Uncle Pete had taken to baking when he was worried about something. The whole diner staff had gained 5 pounds from his concern. Mira sat down at table 3, running her fingers over the familiar scratches in its surface. "I keep thinking about tomorrow," she admitted. "About the festival, about Mr. Lee, about—" She gestured around the diner. "All of this." The evening crowd was starting to trickle in. A young couple sat in the corner booth where they'd had their first date 6 months ago. The night shift truck drivers were beginning to arrive, each ordering their usual with a tired smile. At the counter, Mrs. Kumar was sharing her crossword puzzle with a teenage busboy, teaching him new words between sips of decaf. "You know what I just realized?" Mira said, more to herself than anyone else. "Every song I've written, it's all been about this place. About all of you." She pulled out her festival piece, the pages now soft from constant handling. There was the gentle melody she'd written after watching an elderly man help his wife with her coat every Sunday morning. The upbeat section inspired by the way Uncle Pete danced while flipping pancakes when he thought no one was watching. The quiet, hopeful notes that came from observing countless first dates, job interviews, and quiet celebrations over coffee and pie. "Remember that rainy night last month?" she asked Uncle Pete. "When that college student was crying about failing her exam, and you made her that special hot chocolate. That's in here too. She pointed to a particular section of the music. It sounds like comfort and kindness and never giving up. The door chimed as more customers entered. Mira stood up, automatically reaching for her order pad, but something had shifted inside her. Each step felt different now, more purposeful. She served coffee to the truck drivers, remembering how their late-night stories about long roads and distant homes had inspired the bridge section of her song. She brought extra napkins to the young couple, smiling as she recognized their she glances in the romantic swell of her chorus. "Your usual, Mrs. Kumar?" she asked, already knowing the answer. "Of course, dear. And perhaps a slice of courage pie for tomorrow?" Mrs. Kumar winked, folding her newspaper. "Though I don't think you need it anymore." As Mira moved through the evening rush, each interaction seemed to highlight a different part of her music. The clinking plates were her percussion, the murmured conversations her harmony, and all these people, her accidental family, were the heart of every note. Near closing time, she found herself back at table 3. Tomorrow, she'd perform at the festival. People would see her as a musician, maybe even judge her as one. But standing here, in her slightly stained uniform, surrounded by the warm buzz of diner life, she realized something important. She pulled out her phone and dialed Mr. Lee's hospital room. The night nurse had gotten used to her evening calls. "I figured it out," she told him, not even waiting for a hello. "All this time, I've been worried about being more than a waitress. But that's not it at all. Being a waitress, it's what makes my music real. It's where all the stories come from." She could hear Mr. Lee's soft chuckle on the other end of the line. He couldn't speak much yet, but she knew he understood. "Tomorrow," she continued, watching the last customers of the day gather their belongings, "I'm not going to play for the judges. I'm going to play for the college student who needed hot chocolate on a bad night. For the couple in the corner booth falling in love over French fries. For you and Mrs. Kumar and Uncle Pete and everyone else who's part of this song." After hanging up, Mira tied her apron strings a little tighter. She had one more shift to work before tomorrow's performance. One more chance to gather the everyday music of this place, to remind herself that sometimes the most beautiful symphonies are written in coffee spills and kindness. The festival auditorium buzzed with nervous energy. Backstage, Mira stood in her diner uniform, surrounded by performers in elegant concert wear. She'd thought about wearing something fancy, but when she opened her closet that morning, she knew. This was her armor, her badge of honor. The small coffee stain on her sleeve felt like a good luck charm. 5 minutes, called the stage manager, making Mira's heart jump into her throat. Through the curtain, she could hear the murmur of the crowd. Her hands trembled as she straightened her apron for the 100th time. Looking out into the wings, she spotted them. Her people, her story. Uncle Pete had closed the diner early, hanging a sign that read, "Gone to support our star." The entire staff had come, even Miss Patel, who was trying to hide her excitement behind her usual stern expression. Mrs. Kumar sat in the front row, armed with tissues and her biggest smile. The teenage busboy had brought his whole family. Even some of the regular customers had shown up. The truck drivers had rearranged their routes. The young couple from the corner booth held hands nervously. And the crossword puzzle enthusiasts clutched their newspapers like good luck charms. Next up, the announcer's voice boomed, performing an original composition. Mira closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. The scent of coffee still clung to her uniform, grounding her. When she opened her eyes again, she saw an empty wheelchair being pushed through the side door. Her heart skipped. There was Mr. Lee, being helped to his seat by a nurse. He looked tired, but his eyes were bright, and when he caught her gaze, he gave her a small nod that said everything. "Please welcome to the stage." As Mira walked out, the spotlight felt warm like morning sun through the diner windows. The grand piano waited, its sleek surface so different from Mr. Lee's weathered upright. But when she sat down, placing her hands on the keys, she wasn't in the auditorium anymore. She was in the diner, surrounded by the music of everyday life. Her fingers found the first notes, soft, like early morning light creeping through windows. The melody grew like the day itself, building with each story she had to tell. Here was the gentle swell of Mrs. Kumar's daily crossword puzzle routine. There the playful dance of Uncle Pete's cooking rhythms. The young couple's love story floated through the higher notes, while the truck driver's late-night tales rumbled in the bass line. Every person who'd ever shared their hopes and dreams over a cup of coffee had a voice in her song. The middle section quieted, becoming tender and thoughtful. This was for Mr. Lee. For every morning, he'd spent teaching her that music wasn't just about the notes, but about the life between them. She could feel him listening, could almost hear him humming along like he used to do during their practice sessions. As she played the final movement, Mira felt something shift in the room. The audience had gone completely still. Even the stage lights seemed to be holding their breath. This wasn't just her story anymore. It had become everyone's story, a song about finding extraordinary beauty in ordinary moments. The last notes hung in the air like steam rising from a fresh cup of coffee. For a moment, there was absolute silence. Then, from somewhere in the back, someone started clapping. The sound spread like ripples in water, growing until it filled the entire auditorium. Mira stood, her legs shaking slightly, and bowed. Through tears, she saw Mr. Lee struggling to his feet, leaning on his nurse but determined to join the standing ovation. Uncle Pete was openly crying, Mrs. Kumar was hugging strangers, and the teenage busboy was whistling loud enough to wake the whole city. Later, after the judges had awarded their prizes, she won second place. Though that hardly seemed to matter, Mira found herself surrounded by her diner family. They were all talking at once, planning a celebration at the diner with Uncle Pete's famous apple pie. Mr. Lee made his way over, moving slowly but steadily. "You played their song," he said softly, his voice still weak but full of pride. "You play all of our songs." Mira looked around at these people who had become so much more than customers and coworkers. "I finally understood," she said, straightening her apron. "Some people write symphonies about great battles or epic love stories. I wrote mine about coffee cups and kindness, about ordinary people finding their music in ordinary moments. There's nothing ordinary about any of it." Mr. Lee smiled, patting her hand. "Or about you." The group made their way out of the auditorium, heading back to the diner where Uncle Pete had promised free pie for everyone. Mira walked among them, still in her uniform, still a waitress, but now also undeniably a musician. She had played her heart out, serving up her music just like she served her customers, with care, with love, and with the understanding that sometimes the most beautiful melodies are found in the simplest moments.